Okay guys, so now we want to work on displaying the questions, okay, but then we should have the questions, and because I do not have any intention of wasting your time, I'll just paste the question here and then walk through it with you. So inside this question, it is an array of objects, and each object has a category option, the question itself, the options, and then the correct option. Okay, so that is it. You can go ahead and create something similar to this, or you can create any question of your choice. Okay, that is just up to you to decide. So I have 4 questions here, and each one of them has a category, a question statement, the 4 options, and then the correct option. Okay, so now let's move on to how to display the question. So let's come here, const display question. Okay, now this display question will take a question index, because as you can see from here, we are showing one question at a time. Okay, so we need to take a question index. So let's do just that. I'll come here. Okay, so equal to question index. And the first thing that I need to do is to get a couple of containers. Okay, so let me just take you back to the main thing and then we'll see. So we have the main container here. Okay, inside the main container we will have a sub container. Inside the sub container we will have these things. So we will create all these things using the JavaScript. Okay, so let's do just that. Now the first thing that I need to do is to get the question that I want to display. So I'll say const question, and this question is coming from the questions, but then I want to fetch just one, which is the current index. Okay, so question index. So that is it right here. Now the next thing that I need to do is to get the question container. Okay, I should create a question container. So const question container, that one will come from the document dot query selector, and then dot question container. Okay, great. So now that I have the question container, I want to set its value to empty string. Okay, so let's call the question container dot inner HTML and set its value to empty string. Okay, now the first thing that I'm going to create is to create the quiz test. Okay, which is an H1 element. So let's do that. Quiz test. So const quiz test equal to document dot create element. This one is being created by the JavaScript and it is an H1 element. Now I want to add my class name to it, so I'll call the quiz test dot class list dot add, and then I'll add my quiz test as my class name. Afterwards, what I intend to do is to set it inner test. Okay, so I'll just call my quiz test dot inner HTML or inner test, either one of them. This time around I'll use the backtick so that I can use the template literal. Okay, so I'll say question, and then I'll bring my $, opening and closing curly bracket, and then put the question index, which is the current question index of, then I'll bring another $, and then questions array dot length. Okay, like this. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is to create the question itself. Okay, so I'll come here and say question test and then I'll create my variable called question test, and then I will use the document dot create element into bracket. It's a paragraph. Okay, I will call the question test dot class list dot add into bracket. The class will be question test. Okay, afterwards I would like to set its value, so I will call the question test dot inner HTML and set the value to question dot question, like this. Okay, so this question is coming from this one here. Okay, this one, the one that we fetch using the index. Okay, so we set the value right here. Now the next one is to do with the options. Okay, so let me come here and say options container. Okay, so I'll create it option container document dot create element, and then it's going to be a div. Okay, now the next thing to do is to give it a class name, so I'll call the option container, should be options container. Okay, so that to be meaningful, options container dot class list dot add, and then to be options container, right? Great. So now the next thing is to map the options. Okay, so I'll say map through options. So now let's do just that. So I'll just fetch the question dot options dot map, and then for each option, what I intend to do is to create an option container. Okay, so I'll say option container, so that to be meaningful, option container equal to document dot create element is going to be a div. I will give this one a class name, so option container dot class list dot add into bracket option, like this. Then afterwards I will create a checkbox. Okay, so check box, I'll say const check box equal to document dot create element. This element is going to be an input. What I'll need to do is to call the checkbox and then set an attribute. So the attribute that I wish to set is called type, and then the value for this attribute is checkbox, to make sure that it is indeed a checkbox. Now what I intend to do is to give this checkbox an ID. Okay, so I'll call the checkbox again, the set attribute again, and then this time around I'm setting an ID, and then the ID is going to be the option dot ID, which is from the question. Okay, let me show you real quick. So as you can see, every option has an ID and then a text. Okay, so that is the ID we are fetching right here. Okay, great. Now the next thing to deal with is the label, right? So let me come here and say label, and then I'll say const label equal to document dot create element, and then it is a label, like this. Now the first thing that I intend to do is to give it some attributes. So the first one will be label dot set attribute, and then the attribute that I wish to set is called 4. Okay, and then I'm setting its value to the option dot id. Okay, great, so that when I click on it, it will be able to check or uncheck the checkbox. Okay, now I also need to give it some value, so I'll set the label dot inner HTML to option dot test. Okay, like this. Great. So I'll also give it a class name, so I'll call the label dot class list dot add, and then the class list will be option dot id, like this, and then save. Okay, great. So now we are done. The next thing to do is to append children. Okay, so I'll say append children. So now let's do just that. Now the first thing to append is the checkbox and then the label to the option container. So let's do just that. I'll call my option container dot append. I will append the checkbox and then also the label. Now this one is done. The next thing is to append the option container to the options container. Okay, so I'll call the options container dot append, and then what I'm going to append is the option container, like this. Now the next thing to append is the quiz test, the question test, and then the options container to the question container. So I'll come here and call the question container dot append, and then I will append the quiz test. Quiz test. I will also append the question test, and finally the options container, like this. Okay, great. So we are done. Now the next thing to do is to trigger this particular function. Okay, and we want it to happen on load, but then let's do just that. So I'll say fire, okay, call display question function on load. Okay, so I'll just call the window dot load on load, and then I will call the display question, like this. But don't forget that the display question function takes a parameter. Okay, so what we need to do is that we will create the variable here. So I'll say const question index and set its value to 0. Okay, so this will be the one we will pass as argument of this function. Okay, so now let's see. Now you see we have our first question here. Okay, let me just type some random name here, and boom, we have our first question. Unfortunately, it says question 0. There's nothing like question 0. So what it means is that over here, where is it? Over here it should be +1. Okay, so +1. I will explain to you why it should be +1 in no time. Okay, so let's just do this, and yes, we have it right there. Everything works perfectly. All right, okay, good. So now let me walk you through this code one more time. So we have a function here called display question, and it takes question index as its parameter. Now what we do is that out of the questions, we fetch one question based on the index, okay? And once we get a question, what we need to do is to fetch this container from the HTML page and set its initial value to empty string. Afterwards, we create this quiz test and then give it a dynamic data, okay, which says question index +1 of questions.length. Now, if you remember, we said that counting arrays in JavaScript begins at 0. So what it means is that the question number 1 has an index of 0. The question number 2 has an index of 1 in that order, okay? So if you want to target the question 1, it is the question index +1, okay? So that 0 + 1 will give us 1, 1 + 1 will give us 2 in that order, okay? So that is why we have this particular string over here. Now afterwards, we create a paragraph, give it a class name, and then assign the question to it as its value. Afterwards, we create options container. Inside the options container, we will have a map method, okay? And this map method will map through each option in the options of the question, and each of them, it will create a div or a container called option container. And then inside the option container, we will have a checkbox with an ID of the question, the option ID, and then a type of checkbox. We will also create a label with an attribute for, which is set to the option.id, okay? Afterwards, we set its value to the text of the option. Afterwards, we append the checkbox and then the label to the option container. We append the option container to the options container. We now append the quiz test, the question test, and then the options container to the question container. And then afterwards, once the page is fully loaded, we call on this particular function, okay? So coming next is choosing our answer and then moving on to the next question. Don't go away.